When to compete and when to cooperate. This is the essence of the open source question from a business perspective. And what I'd like to get at in this presentation is why and perhaps when open source makes sense. So I'm Mike Schwartz. I'm the founder and CEO of Gluu. We have an open source identity and access management product. You can find us on Twitter at Gluu Federation or on the web at gluu.org. And I'm also the host of a podcast called Open Source Underdogs, where I interviewed the founders, CEOs, and other business leaders at successful open source companies and tried to understand how they're using open source as part of their business model. So apologies, the podcasts are in English, but if you can listen and you're thinking about starting a company based on an open source product, I highly, highly, highly recommend you listen to this podcast and get firsthand advice from these people who are sort of in the middle of this. And remember that every business is different, and therefore how you use open sources is different. And I found that I thought I knew a lot about open source, but I learned a little bit from every guest. And I think that this is will be really helpful to help you really understand in a much more sort of nuanced way how open source can make sense as part of a business model. When I talk about open source, I always like to talk about these three different categories. There's community open source projects, corporate open source projects, and pure play open source projects. Community open source is when a person or a group of friends or a group of companies decide that they want to collaborate on a piece of software, and they do it because it's something they are interested in or it's a project that they love, but there's not necessarily any business model behind it. And there's a lot of really important projects that fall under this category. And a lot of these projects really we need to figure out how to better support. There's libraries and also software projects that are really community driven. Corporate open source is where you have a company who's decided that an open source software project makes sense for them to collaborate on with a wider community, but it's not necessarily part of their main business offering. A good example would be Kubernetes. Google has really helped fund the Kubernetes project. They don't sell Kubernetes, but they decided it would be worthwhile for them to collaborate with a larger ecosystem of developers because this was sort of a non-differentiating piece of technology that they wanted um, to develop. Even Apple, who's known for being very proprietary and protective of intellectual property, has open source Foundation DB because I guess they decided they're not a database company and they would like to collaborate with a larger community. So for this reason, you'll find that the largest open source contributors are large companies, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Uber, IBM, Oracle, all have large open source project undertakings because they feel like these projects aren't their core business. The last category I talk about is pure play open source companies. This is where there is a company behind an open source project and the project is their main product. So Gluu fits into this category. The Gluu server is our main product, but lots of other companies fit into this category. In fact, pure play open source companies were the theme of the podcast. So if you listen to the podcast, you'll see there's 50 plus pure play open source companies, and there's a lot more out there than the ones that I interviewed. It's important to talk about these differentiations because when you talk to people who don't understand open source, they'll sometimes conflate these different types of projects and they'll talk about open source having bad support, but maybe they're talking about community open source. So it's important to help people understand that not all open source is the same. If you're thinking about starting a business around open source, the really, really important question you need to answer is, how does open sourcing the software help you achieve your business goals? And if it doesn't, then you shouldn't open source the software. That some people might feel maybe ethically or altruistically inclined to open source the software, but but I would say that would be a mistake if it didn't further one of your business objectives. And what are the most common business objectives in when you open source your software? Believe it or not, I think trust is the most important one. There's a saying that nothing builds trust like source code. So the transparency of the open source development process can lead customers to really better understand the quality of your software and to be able to trust the code and trust what's in your code. So I think trust is really important. Better code. Open source is fundamentally a development methodology. It's not a business model. It's a way to write the code. It's a really great distributed development strategy. And and the result of that development strategy is better code. And and transparency helps drive better code too, I believe. And that with our modern CI/CD infrastructure and transparency in that process, I believe leads to less bugs per thousand lines of code than commercial development methodologies. And there have been studies that have shown that that's actually the case. A third reason I would cite is innovation, that having more people and more companies collaborating in an ecosystem can drive innovation, where initially you might say that a commercial company throwing lots of capital behind a business problem and can jump out in front. Over the long term, for infrastructure code, especially large infrastructure problems, what's been shown is that actually innovation can be increased by using an open source development methodology. Look at Linux. That's a good example. It's a big problem. It might be hard for one company to tackle every um, requirement for Linux, but there's lots of other examples in the database and CRM. And in some ways, sometimes you might say open sourcing actually slows innovation. In my podcast with the founder of WordPress, he said, well, we could just write it faster. But when we write it with a community, it ends up being better. And so there can be a trade-off in innovation at times, but I think ultimately innovation over the long term is increased by putting more brains together and more diversity together. I think it helps drive innovation. And of course, marketing. The founder of MongoDB has recently said that the freemium method, the freemium offering of MongoDB helped drive adoption, which was important to them. And certainly open source is a brilliant distribution model. It enables you to get, quote unquote, shelf space. It helps you get your software in front of potential customers who could use it, and they can they can try by fly. It makes trying the software easier. So certainly, especially for, let's say, disruptors in the market, there is certainly a marketing advantage to open sourcing your code and getting your code into customers. Your not just your code, but your product based on the open source code into the hands of customers. So that's where I'm going to leave it today. And I encourage you to go to the podcast, Open Source Underdogs, to find out more. And I wish you the best of luck in pursuing an open source business model. Thank you.